I'm Michael Carter, and before my life split cleanly down the middle, I used to think I understood who I was. I was 38 years old, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered from years of manual discipline and gym routines I kept to stay sane, with prematurely graying hair that my wife once said made me look dependable. I worked as a senior project manager for a mid-sized construction and infrastructure firm based in Illinois, the kind of job that didn't make headlines but paid well enough to keep a household comfortable. I wasn't flashy, wasn't loud, and never tried to be anything more than steady. My mother used to say I inherited my patience from my father and my stubborn loyalty from her, traits that defined every choice I made, including the worst one. If you love ruthless revenge stories packed with shocking twists, like this video and subscribe now. New, never-before-seen stories are released here every day, each more intense than the last. I met Rachel when I was 29, and she was 26, in the least dramatic way possible, at a charity networking dinner organized by my company. She worked in corporate marketing for a regional logistics firm, polished and articulate, with an easy laugh that made people lean in when she spoke. I remember noticing how confidently she held eye contact, like she was always evaluating the room and deciding where she belonged. We started talking over lukewarm coffee and ended up spending the entire evening together, ignoring everyone else. She liked that I was grounded, or at least that's what she told me. I liked that she seemed ambitious without being cruel, driven without being reckless, and warm in a way that felt real. We dated for 4 years before getting married, a timeline that felt responsible and mature at the time. I was 33, she was 30, and by then our lives had settled into a predictable rhythm. I was climbing steadily at work, overseeing multi-million-dollar projects, while Rachel was transitioning into a higher-paying strategic role with better visibility and longer hours. We married in a modest ceremony outside Chicago, surrounded by friends, co-workers, and my mother, who cried harder than anyone else. Rachel wore ivory, not white, and joked that it was because she was too honest with tradition. I laughed then, not realizing how sharp honesty could become when used as a weapon. My best friend Andrew Miller stood beside me as my best man, a role he had earned over 2 decades of shared history. Andrew and I met in college, survived bad apartments, worse jobs, and a handful of mistakes that bonded us in ways words never quite capture. He worked in financial consulting, sharp-minded and socially magnetic, the kind of guy who could walk into any room and make people feel like he belonged there. Rachel liked him immediately, and I never questioned it. Why would I? He was practically family. We spent holidays together, celebrated promotions together, and trusted each other with a kind of blind faith that only comes from time. For most of our marriage, things looked stable from the outside. We lived in a well-kept suburban home, took 1 vacation a year, hosted dinner parties, and paid our bills on time. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the emotional balance shifted. Rachel began to change, subtly at first, then unmistakably. She criticized my routine, my caution, my unwillingness to take risks. She talked more about potential and what could be, while I focused on maintaining what we had already built. Our conversations became transactional, efficient, stripped of warmth. I told myself it was stress, that her career demands were heavier, that marriage naturally settled into quieter forms of love. I told myself many things, most of them wrong. Then my mother got sick, and everything else faded into the background. She had been my anchor since my father passed, the one person who never doubted me, never measured my worth by my momentum. When the diagnosis came, it was aggressive and unkind, the kind that doesn't offer much time for bargaining. I became her primary caregiver, balancing work deadlines with hospital visits, late-night calls with doctors, and the slow heartbreak of watching someone strong grow fragile. Rachel supported me in public, offered rehearsed sympathy in front of others, but at home she grew distant, impatient with my exhaustion and distracted grief. When my mother finally passed, it felt like the last stable pillar in my life collapsed. The house fell hollow, quieter than it had ever been, and grief settled into my bones like something permanent. I needed time, space, and understanding things I assumed marriage automatically provided. Instead, Rachel withdrew completely. She avoided the subject, avoided me, and spent more evenings working late or meeting friends I rarely saw. Andrew checked in often, offered to grab drinks, told me I wasn't alone. I leaned on him more than ever, unaware that loyalty, like everything else, can be conditional. The day Rachel told me she was leaving, her voice was calm, almost relieved. She said she needed more, that my grief had changed me, that she couldn't keep waiting for me to come back to life. She didn't mention Andrew at first. That truth came later, delivered without apology, as if inevitability excused betrayal. I remember standing there, numb, barely processing her words, thinking only that I had lost my mother and my marriage in the same season. What I didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my mother had left me more than memories. And when the truth finally surfaced, it would change everything. The weeks after Rachel walked out blurred together in a way that still feels unreal when I think back on it. I functioned on autopilot, waking up, go to work, coming home to a house that no longer felt like mine. Every room carried echoes. Her shoes by the door that were suddenly gone, the scent of her perfume fading from the bedroom, the silence at dinner that replaced conversations we used to have. I moved through those days hollowed out, grieving two losses at once, and telling myself that if I just endured long enough, the pain would dull. What I didn't realize then was that endurance without direction only deepens a wound. Rachel didn't waste time rewriting her life. Within a month, the truth she had tried to soften finally landed with its full weight. She wasn't just leaving me. She was moving in with Andrew, my best friend, the man who had sworn loyalty to me at our wedding, who had listened to me break down over my mother's hospital bed, who had looked me in the eyes and told me everything would be okay. When I confronted him, his voice was measured, almost professional, as if he were explaining a market correction rather than a betrayal. He said feelings just happened, that no one planned for this, that life was complicated. I didn't argue. I simply hung up and let the silence speak for me. Publicly, they played their roles well. Mutual friends were fed a carefully edited version of events. How my grief had made me distant, how Rachel had felt lonely, how Andrew had stepped in as a support system. I became the quiet, broken man people pitied but didn't question deeply. At work, I took fewer leadership roles, delegated more than usual, and allowed colleagues to assume I was unraveling. That assumption would later become useful. At the time, though, it only reinforced the image of a man who had lost control of his own life. Someone easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. What no one knew was that while my personal life collapsed, a separate process had already begun, one my mother had quietly set in motion years earlier. She had always been private about her finances, insisting she live modestly because peace is more valuable than display. I respected that, never asking questions, never prying. After a funeral, I received a call from a law firm I had never heard of, requesting a meeting regarding my mother's estate. I assumed it would be about settling small accounts or handling paperwork. I nearly postponed it, thinking I wasn't emotionally ready. I'm glad I didn't. The meeting took place in a downtown office that felt sterile and formal, the kind of place where emotions were processed into numbers and clauses. The attorney explained that my mother had placed a majority of her assets into a series of trusts years earlier, structured carefully, legally, and deliberately. She had been an early investor in several technology and real estate ventures through a private holding company she never discussed. The numbers that followed didn't register at first. It wasn't until he slid a summary document across the table that my breath caught. The total valuation exceeded $300 million. Not potential, not projections, liquid and managed wealth. I sat there in silence, struggling to reconcile the woman who clipped coupons and drove an aging sedan with the reality laid out in front of me. The attorney explained her reasoning calmly, almost respectfully. She believed wealth changed people, exposed intentions, and she wanted me to inherit it only when I was mature enough to protect it in myself. That was why the final transfer activated only after her passing. I didn't cry then. I felt something colder, sharper, clarity. For the first time since everything fell apart, the chaos around me slowed enough for me to think. I didn't tell anyone, not a single person. I returned to my empty house and sat in the dark, replaying the last few months with new perspective. Rachel had measured my worth by momentum and status. Andrew had calculated loyalty the same way he calculated profit. They both believed I was finished, emotionally broken, and financially ordinary. That belief was their greatest mistake. I realized then that grief had stripped me down, but it hadn't erased me. It had simply removed distractions. And with resources like these, patience became power. I began planning quietly, deliberately, the way my mother would have approved of. I met with advisors, accountants, and legal experts under confidentiality agreements tighter than steel. I studied my enemies not with rage, but with interest. Rachel and Andrew were building a life together, publicly celebrating their engagement, privately entangling finances and reputations. Andrew's consulting firm relied heavily on investor confidence. Rachel's career thrived on image, association, and access. They thought they had won. They thought I was watching from the wreckage. What they didn't understand was that I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. The first thing I learned after inheriting that kind of wealth was how invisible it could be when handled correctly. Money doesn't always announce itself with cars and mansions. Sometimes it hides behind silence, behind shell companies, behind decisions made in boardrooms where no one knows your face. I kept my job, kept my routine, and kept my appearance deliberately unchanged. I still drove the same car, still wore the same suits to work, still let co-workers assume I was barely holding myself together. Every assumption they made about my fragility gave me cover, and I learned quickly that being underestimated was far more powerful than being feared. I spent months educating myself, not recklessly, but methodically. I met with analysts who specialized in corporate exposure, legal strategists who understood regulatory pressure, and private investigators who knew how to follow paper trails without triggering alarms. I didn't ask for revenge plans. I asked for information. I wanted to understand how reputations were built, how they were protected, and more importantly, how they quietly collapsed. Andrew's firm came up more often than I expected. It wasn't illegal, not on the surface, but it was fragile. Over-leveraged partnerships, inflated performance narratives, and investors whose confidence mattered more than actual stability. Rachel, meanwhile, was thriving in the spotlight. Her social media told a story of reinvention, of liberation, of a woman who had chosen herself. She spoke openly about moving on from grief, about emotional growth, carefully omitting whose grief she had abandoned. Friends congratulated her courage. Some even told me they hoped I was healing too, their pity wrapped in politeness. I never corrected them. I watched quietly, learning how much she relied on validation, how dependent she was on appearing ahead of the narrative. Image wasn't just important to her. It was currency. Andrew proposed to her 6 months after our divorce finalized. An engagement announcement spread quickly through our shared circles. I heard about it secondhand, through a co-worker who didn't realize the name still cut. I felt nothing like the rage people expect in stories like this. What I felt was confirmation. They had moved too fast, built too publicly, and anchored their future on assumptions about permanence. People who believe they've escaped consequences tend to grow careless. Carelessness leaves footprints. I started by repositioning myself professionally, but subtly. Through a private investment arm, I acquired minority stakes in firms adjacent to Andrew's business ecosystem. Not competitors, partners, vendors, service providers. The kinds of companies executives rarely scrutinize until something breaks. I never attached my name directly. Everything flowed through entities structured to appear unrelated, managed by people whose loyalty was contractually enforced. From the outside, nothing changed. From the inside, information began to surface organically, as it always does when money starts flowing differently. At the same time, I began rebuilding my public self, but slowly, intentionally. I accepted speaking invitations at industry events I had previously declined, presented myself as a man who had found clarity after loss. People love redemption arcs, especially quiet ones. They started seeing me not as broken, but reflective, resilient. Rachel noticed. I could tell from the way her tone shifted when our paths crossed at mutual gatherings. She was polite, distant, but watchful. Success attracts attention, especially from those who once dismissed you. Andrew reached out eventually, proposing we clear the air. His message was casual, confident, as if enough time had passed to neutralize betrayal. I agreed to meet, choosing a public place where appearances mattered. He talked more than I did, explaining his growth, his engagement, his hopes for the future. He never apologized outright. He framed everything as evolution. I listened, nodded, and offered nothing personal in return. When he left, he looked relieved. He thought he had closed the chapter. In reality, he had confirmed every weakness I needed to understand. By the end of the year, I had positioned myself not as an adversary, but as a presence, someone influential, respected, and disconnected from old drama. Rachel and Andrew saw me occasionally at events, always composed, always calm. They couldn't reconcile the man they had abandoned with the one standing in front of them. That confusion unsettled them, even if they didn't admit it. People sense imbalance before they recognize danger. And while they celebrated milestones and planned a wedding built on borrowed trust, I was already several steps ahead, waiting for the moment when truth, pressure, and timing would intersect. Revenge, I learned, isn't loud when done correctly. It doesn't announce itself with threats or confrontations. It waits. It observes. And when it finally moves, it does so with precision, leaving no room for recovery. By then, the outcome feels inevitable, as if fate itself had chosen sides. And soon, very soon, Rachel and Andrew will begin to understand exactly how expensive betrayal can be. By the time the wedding invitations went out, the foundation beneath Rachel and Andrew's carefully constructed life had already begun to crack, though neither of them could feel it yet. From the outside, everything looked flawless. An upscale venue booked months in advance, glossy engagement photos circulating online, and conversations filled with optimism about their future. But behind that shine was a delicate structure held together by assumptions, shortcuts, and trust placed in the wrong places. I understood now that the most effective way to dismantle something like that wasn't to strike at the center, but to apply pressure at the edges, slowly enough that panic set in before understanding ever did. The first visible shift came through Andrew's business, though he didn't realize it at the time. 2 mid-sized institutional clients quietly declined to renew contracts, citing internal restructuring. A third delayed a planned investment round indefinitely. None of this was catastrophic on its own, but it disrupted cash flow and forced Andrew to explain things to partners who were used to smooth projections and confident forecasts. I watched all of this through reports forwarded to me by people whose names Andrew would never see. What fascinated me wasn't the financial stress itself, but how quickly it affected his demeanor. Confidence thinned. Calls became sharper. Smiles became rehearsed. Rachel felt the tension long before she understood its source. Her career thrived on perception, on being associated with growth, momentum, and success. When Andrew started canceling events or showing up distracted, she compensated by leaning harder into public appearances, projecting stability with forced enthusiasm. But people noticed mismatches. Colleagues began asking careful questions. Invitations slowed. The unspoken rule of her world was simple: attach yourself to winners and distance yourself from uncertainty. She had abandoned me when grief made me inconvenient. Now she was tied to someone whose trajectory no longer pointed cleanly upward. I didn't rush the next step. Patience was the advantage my mother had taught me, even if she never framed it as strategy. Instead, I allowed Andrew's firm to struggle just enough to make him seek solutions. That was when one of my holding companies appeared, not as a savior, but as an opportunity, a potential partnership, additional capital, strategic alignment. The proposal was clean, attractive, and framed as mutually beneficial. Andrew reviewed it himself, never suspecting the hand behind it. Desperation has a way of dulling intuition. especially in people accustomed to being in control. As negotiations progressed, I made my first deliberate move into their shared space. Rachel attended one of the industry events connected to partnership, surprised to see me there, not as an observer but as a featured speaker. I watched her expression carefully when our eyes met. Confusion first, then calculation. She hadn't realized how far I had moved beyond the version of me she left behind. We exchanged polite words, nothing personal, but the imbalance between us was unmistakable. For the first time, she wasn't sure who held the advantage, and that uncertainty unsettled her more than anger ever could. Andrew, meanwhile, mistook my composure for forgiveness. He mentioned my presence casually at home, framing it as coincidence, even complimenting my bounce back. Rachel listened closely, filing away details she didn't yet understand. She began asking questions about my role, my connections, my sudden visibility. Andrew brushed them off, too focused on stabilizing his firm to examine the deeper implications. That oversight would cost him. People who prioritize survival over awareness often fail to see traps forming directly beneath them. As the partnership neared finalization, regulatory scrutiny followed, as it always does when money moves in unfamiliar patterns. Audits were requested, documents were reviewed, past decisions resurfaced for reevaluation. Nothing false, nothing planted, just exposed. Andrew's firm had survived for years by staying slightly ahead of attention. Now attention had arrived all at once. The stress showed in him physically. He lost weight, slept poorly, and grew defensive. Rachel, accustomed to security, began to feel something she hadn't expected so soon after her fresh start: fear. I stayed distant, visible only where necessary, letting the situation unfold naturally. When Rachel finally reached out to me directly, it wasn't with accusation or apology, but curiosity masked as concern. She asked how I had been, mentioned how strong I looked, how proud she was of my growth. I responded kindly, briefly, and without invitation. Nothing confuses manipulative people more than a lack of access. She didn't know yet that the story she thought she had escaped was still unfolding, and that she was no longer the one controlling the narrative. By the time whispers began circulating about postponed wedding plans and temporary business challenges, I knew the final phase was approaching. The pressure had done its work. Cracks had formed not just in their finances, but in their trust in each other. And as they struggled to keep appearances intact, I prepared to step fully into the open, not as a victim seeking closure, but as a man who had already won. The collapse didn't come all at once. It never does when pride is involved. It came in stages, measured and humiliating, each one stripping away a layer of certainty Rachel and Andrew had wrapped themselves in. The partnership Andrew believed would save his firm triggered deeper examinations than he anticipated, and once scrutiny starts, it rarely limits itself to what's presented. Past deals were re-examined, risk disclosures revisited, and suddenly the language around his firm changed from innovative to concerning. I watched from a distance as confidence eroded not because of a single scandal, but because trust quietly withdrew, one investor, one advisor, one ally at a time. Rachel felt that shift immediately, though she tried to pretend she didn't. The wedding plans were paused, then quietly scaled back, then avoided altogether in conversation. The venue deposit was lost. Sponsors she expected to leverage for branding opportunities stopped returning calls. Her professional circle, once warm and affirming, grew polite and non-committal. She had built her identity around momentum, around the idea that she was always moving upward, always aligned with success. Now she was stuck defending choices she once celebrated, and the strain of that contradiction showed in every forced smile and carefully edited post. Andrew unraveled faster than I expected, not financially, but emotionally. Men like him are conditioned to believe intelligence guarantees control, and when that illusion breaks, they spiral. He became irritable, suspicious, and increasingly isolated, convinced someone was working against him, but unable to identify who. That paranoia seeped into his relationship with Rachel. Arguments replaced strategy meetings. Accusations replaced reassurance. Each of them began quietly calculating exit routes, the same way they once calculated how to justify leaving me. Betrayal, I learned, rarely creates loyalty. It simply delays the next fracture. It was during this period that the final audit findings surfaced, not catastrophic, but damning enough to demand accountability. Andrew's firm faced penalties, restructuring demands, and a public downgrade that would take years to recover from, if recovery was even possible. He lost his position not through termination, but through mutual agreement, the corporate equivalent of exile. The headlines were polite. The implications were not. His reputation, once his greatest asset, became a liability others carefully avoided. And with that fall came the sudden evaporation of the future Rachel had attached herself to. Rachel reached out to me again, this time without pretense. There was no flirtation, no performance, just a strained honesty that would have meant something years earlier. She said she felt lost, that things hadn't turned out the way she expected, that maybe they had both made mistakes. She didn't apologize. Not really. She framed regret as confusion, accountability as miscommunication. I listened, not because I needed closure, but because I wanted to understand how she processed consequence. When she hinted at meeting in person, I declined politely. Some doors closed quietly. They don't slam. They simply stop opening. What surprised me most was not their downfall, but my reaction to it. I didn't feel triumph. I felt distance. Watching them struggle confirmed something I had already learned through grief and inheritance alike. Power doesn't feel like domination. It feels like choice. I chose not to expose them publicly. I chose not to gloat. I chose not to rescue them either. The consequences they faced were proportional, organic, and self-inflicted. I hadn't destroyed them. I had simply stepped aside and let truth apply pressure where illusion once lived. As their relationship deteriorated under the weight of shared failure, I continued building my own life deliberately and privately. I transitioned fully out of my old job, stepping into leadership roles within ventures that aligned with my values, not my ego. I funded initiatives my mother would have respected, supported innovation without spectacle, and built a network that valued discretion over noise. People began to know my name, but not my story. And that anonymity, paired with influence, became my preferred form of security. The last time I saw Rachel was at a crowded professional event months later. She looked smaller somehow, less certain, her confidence no longer effortless. Our eyes met briefly across the room. There was recognition there and something else, understanding maybe or resignation. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The imbalance between us was no longer financial or emotional. It was existential. I had outgrown the version of myself she left, and she was still reckoning with the cost of who she chose to become. By then, the revenge I once thought I wanted no longer mattered. What mattered was that I had reclaimed authorship of my life. And in the final chapter of the story, I would finally step forward, not to punish the past, but to define the future on my own terms. By the time everything finally settled, silence became the loudest confirmation that the story had truly ended. Not the dramatic kind of silence people imagine after revenge, but a calm, uninterrupted quiet where nothing chased me anymore. Not anger, not grief, not unfinished conversations. I had spent so long reacting to loss that I didn't immediately recognize peace when it arrived. It wasn't joy or relief. It was stability. For the first time since my mother passed, I woke up without replaying old moments or rehearsing imaginary conversations. My life was no longer defined by what had been taken from me, but by what I now chose to build. Andrew faded from relevance faster than I expected. The business world can be ruthless that way. Once credibility is damaged, people remember you only as a cautionary tale. He resurfaced occasionally through industry gossip, consulting in minor roles, far removed from the influence he once wielded. Rachel didn't stay with him. Their relationship, forged in betrayal and sustained by momentum, couldn't survive accountability and scarcity. She pivoted again, as she always had, reframing the past to suit her next chapter. This time, though, the audience was smaller, the enthusiasm muted. Reinvention works best when people still believe in the myth. I didn't reach out. I didn't need explanations, apologies, or closure ceremonies. What I learned through all of this is that closure isn't something others give you. It's something you claim by refusing to reopen wounds that have already taught you what you needed to know. My mother once told me that dignity isn't proven by how loudly you defend yourself, but by how confidently you walk away when the lesson is complete. I finally understood what she meant. The inheritance she left me wasn't just financial. It was perspective. With time, I allowed myself to live differently. I moved out of the old house and into a place that reflected who I had become rather than who I had been trying to hold on to. I traveled quietly, invested intentionally, and built relationships slowly. I stopped explaining my past to new people. If they stayed, they did so because of who I was in the present, not out of sympathy for who I used to be. Wealth gave me options, but restraint gave me freedom. I learned that the two are not the same. Sometimes people ask how I survived losing everything so quickly. My mother, my marriage, my best friend. I tell them the truth, though rarely in full. I tell them that loss strips away illusions. And if you're paying attention, it leaves behind clarity. The version of me that existed before all this believed loyalty guaranteed safety and love guaranteed permanence. The version standing now understands that trust must be matched by character, and love must be grounded in respect to survive pressure. Those lessons cost me dearly, but they also saved me from repeating the same mistakes. I still think about my mother often. I think about how carefully she planned, how quietly she prepared me for a future she knew I'd one day face alone. She never warned me about betrayal directly. She didn't have to. She taught me patience, self-control, and the value of observing before acting. Everything that followed her passing tested those lessons, and in the end, they held. When I honor her now, it isn't through grief. It's through the life I lead with intention and restraint. This isn't a story about revenge in the way people expect. No courtroom confrontation. No dramatic confession. No public humiliation. It's a story about consequences unfolding naturally once truth is allowed space to breathe. Rachel and Andrew made choices based on assumptions about my worth, my future, and my limits. They were wrong on all counts. I didn't need to destroy them to reclaim myself. I simply had to stop shrinking so they could feel tall. And if there's one thing I've learned above all else, it's this. The most powerful response to betrayal isn't retaliation, it's transcendence. When you outgrow the people who underestimated you, you don't just win, you become untouchable. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and leave a comment letting me know what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.